This is all very exciting. We're playing with all kinds of levels of technology here, so we hope it all works. We've got Ian in Sydney, and we've got Dave out there with the ROVs, and we've got several things going on here. So welcome everybody. This is an event which is part of the National Science Week, and we're very glad that you've been able to join us, because today we've got a really interesting mix of people and things to be talking about. But we're bringing to you a celebration of different local groups with an interest in marine ecology around the Merimbula Wharf. You know, this is special to all of us in all sorts of different ways. And we've come together to explore, record and learn about what happens in the landscape below the surface of the sea. We want to observe whether we can encourage the biodiversity to increase if the macroalgae, the big seaweed, is allowed to grow again. So I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the people and the sea country of the Yuin Nation, the country which nurtures us and where we work and learn. I'm grateful to all traditional owners who continue to share stories and knowledge that help us to respect and care for this very special part of the world. We've got a range of speakers today. We've got expert scientists, got local fishermen and naturalists who all value our coastline in all its biodiversity. We'll also show you some of the science, some of the beauties to be found in this locality. We're delighted to have Dave Rollins from Submerged Entertainment, who will be taking us on an underwater exploration with his ROVs to look at what's there now in the areas that we're monitoring. And we'd like to thank very much for Will, because he's brought us a wonderful selection of his images, his photographs of the creatures that live under the wharf, that live around this area. And you'll be delighted with those when we get to that part of it. So coffee is available. This is complimentary coffee, which is available. We suggest maybe around 11 o'clock. But if you'd like cappuccino or anything like that, then that's available too from Anthony and Sally. And after the presentations, there's a chance for a Q&A session with the people that are here, and Dave will come up from the wall to talk to you. And then a rare opportunity to enjoy a seafood lunch with both sea urchin roe and abalone, which we hope you'll enjoy with us. So our first speaker is Dr. Kane Layton from the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies, University of Tasmania. And Kane's a marine ecologist and lecturer, and his research focuses on the ecology and restoration of kelp forests and temperate reef systems, and also seaweed aquaculture. Kane combines field and lab experiments with scientific diving to examine how kelp forests and reef ecosystems function and persist, especially in the face of increasing human-made pressures. Kane grew up in Canberra and across the south coast, and we're delighted to say he's recently moved back to the area and is going to be living in Bermagui. So we're very pleased to have him back here. And we've known him for quite some time, because Kane put out a call for anybody who was finding the giant kelp, which grows around Tasmania on the beaches here. And Will and myself and a few other people have actually found this species on the beaches here, which is interesting. How did it get here? It doesn't grow off the coast here. So, and Will found how much? 60 centimetres. It's out the back. So if anybody would like to have a look at it, you can see that after the presentations. But I'll just hand over to Kane now to talk to you about his work. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. The amount of time I spent as a kid on the wharf, lying on my belly between the flats, steering and stuff underneath while Dad fished. It's quite funny to come full circle and be back here now talking, especially after being in Tassie for the last 10 years. And like Libby mentioned, I've just moved back and I'm at Bermagui now, which is great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about today about some of the work I've been doing in Tassie, but a little bit also about some of the work that's happening elsewhere in the state, especially in New South Wales, that is, and focusing on seaweed and kelp because that's really my area of expertise, but we'll touch on a lot of these other habitats as well that are really important and that fundamentally make up what's called this Great Southern Reef, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But yeah, a really incredibly photogenic, photogenic, colourful system, which we'll see with Will's photos today. It's incredibly colourful, really spectacular environment that in many ways is really underappreciated. I'm pretty sure almost all of my photos today are taken on the Great Southern Reef. So really like there's nothing overseas, there's nothing really too exotic. You see it, it occurs in our part of the world. Like Libby, I just want to acknowledge the ongoing custodians and the traditional owners of the lands and waters as well, on which I live and work, and that also extends to Tasmania, of course, where I've been for the past decade, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Of course, in this part of the world, that's the Yuin Nation, and in Tasmania, that's the Palawan peoples across Tasmania. Awesome. So this Great Southern Reef. Many people in Australia would have heard of the Great Barrier Reef, and rightly so. It's this globally celebrated reef system. But we also have this incredible temperate cold water reef system in Australia called the Great Southern Reef. And the Great Barrier Reef is a coral reef. It's what creates the structure of that reef is the coral themselves. Whereas the Great Southern Reef is a rocky reef. So it's all the rocks of our coastlines, our headlands, our islands that extend, our rock pools, our tide pools that extend off the coast to create a lot of that complexity, a lot of that habitat initially. But the real kind of secret to the Great Southern Reef is the kelp forests and the seaweed that grows on top of those rocks. It's really, every way that you can think about a forest on land in terms of providing habitat, providing shelter, providing food, it really is almost exactly the same underwater. Those forests are just a bit saltier and a bit more damp. Just like the Great Barrier Reef, the Great Southern Reef is formed from thousands of interconnected reefs, both physically connected, biologically connected. It's actually 4 times as long as the Great Barrier Reef. So you can see on the map here, it stretches from basically Brisbane all the way across our southern coastlines to a similar latitude in Western Australia and all around Tassie as well. And it's a real biodiversity endemism hotspot. And what I mean by endemism is uniqueness. And so depending on the group of animal or plant or seaweed you're looking at, 30 to 80% of those species occur nowhere else in the world. So that means that the Great Southern Reef is not only special to us, as people that live adjacent to it, it's also special globally because we have species and animals that live that occur nowhere else in the world. So it also puts quite a responsibility on us to understand and conserve that reef. Just go back one more briefly. Sorry. So not only is it incredibly environmentally important, it's actually incredibly economically important. About 75% of Australia's population lives within 50 kilometres of the Great Southern Reef. In Tassie, for example, the local paper would run a story on the Great Barrier Reef well before they ran a story on the Great Southern Reef, despite it being on the doorstep of Hobart, despite it being all the way around Tassie. And like I said, it's really economically important. It directly generates about $11 billion with a B dollars to the Australian economy every year. Depending on how you calculate it, that's about 2 to 3 times the value of the Great Barrier Reef. So, we get, again, the Barrier Reef gets celebrated as this big economic powerhouse. Well, actually, the Great Southern Reef is many, many times more valuable than that. And I've emphasised directly there because that's a lot of stuff in terms of fisheries, we hear a lot about today, coastal tourism. It's all those really direct benefits, but we haven't really been able to quantify a lot of those indirect benefits, such as the different types of what we call ecosystem services. So what does that environment do to us in terms of protecting our water quality or helping us find nutrients or carbon for our environment? And that's because we just don't have the money to study this system, unfortunately. It's really massively underappreciated and undervalued and understudied. And that's a real running theme that I'll touch on many times today and across the Great Southern Reef, just how undervalued and understudied it is. Again, comparing it to the Great Barrier Reef, research on the Great Southern Reef gets less than 1% of that research funding. Despite it being 4 times as long, 3 times as valuable, it gets less than 1% of the research funding. And that really hampers our ability to explore and understand this system, and then, as an extension of that, to protect and conserve a really global unique system. But like I said, it's this incredibly photogenic, colourful, incredible environment to work in and to live adjacent to and to dive in. And these photos, as you'll see from Will's photos as well later on, these aren't kind of the most spectacular, amazing dive sites. These are shots that you can see pretty much anywhere you go to the dive on the Great Southern Reef.
Okay, I'll need, all right.
And I should, if anyone wants to get up, grab a coffee, please don't only stop. This isn't a university lecture. Come and go as you like. I won't penalise the marks too hard. But just like all of those incredible organisms we just saw, just click back one. Thank you. We've got the giant Australian cuttlefish, the largest cuttlefish in the world, basically like a swimming rubbish bin. You know, can go to a metre long, can change the colour and the texture of its skin, you know, instantaneously, effectively. Forms these breeding aggregations, these cuttlefish orgies of tens of thousands of individuals in South Australia, globally unique to the Great Southern Reef, nowhere else in the world. We've got, obviously, rock lobster, incredibly economically important, but also really ecologically, environmentally important. We've got crazy starfish. Southern Australia is one of the global hotspots for starfish. More starfish here than many other places in the world. Again, most of which occur nowhere else in the world. Crazy otherworldly sea squirts, crazy fish and invertebrates, and of course very charismatic fish like our weedy sea dragon, where the males do a lot of the parental care. This is the male here with the eggs laid on its tail, which the females look at. Next one. But the real kind of secret, and maybe I'm a little bit biased as mostly a seaweed scientist, the real secret for the Great Southern Reef, or of the Great Southern Reef, is the seaweed. And many people don't know, but the Great Southern Reef is basically like the Amazon, but for seaweed. We have more species of seaweed here than anywhere else in the world, the vast majority of which occur nowhere else in the world, and of which we've probably only really properly studied one or two out of the 1,200, 1,300 species we have. So again, massively globally unique, incredibly photogenic, incredibly colourful environments. These are the kelp specifically on this slide. We have lots of different shapes and textures and sizes, from kind of dark chocolatey browns to almost these golden colours. Giant kelp that we get in mostly Tasmania, parts of South Australia and Victoria as well. It can grow as tall as a 7-storey building. So when you leave here today, turn around and look at the wharf and imagine an underwater forest. Sorry, look at the wharf, building we're in, and imagine a forest that tall underwater. They can even get twice that tall, at least historically. Ball kelp, crazy species that we do get on this part of the coast, it is retracting slightly, so we've heard, again, we haven't had a chance to study it, that those funds just aren't there, unfortunately. But anecdotally, we're hearing from people on the ground, people like yourselves, that, you know, it used to be at places like Tufra, it's retreating, it's nowhere near as common there as it used to be, it's getting to the border, you know, they're seeing it come and go in places like Nadji, Gable Island. Can be, you know, absolutely huge, thick, leathery, not like a delicate little seaweed, it's more like swimming with an animal. There's such a presence in the water. The stalk on it can grow as thick as my thigh, can grow a metre tall, I can hide behind one of them, and I'm, you know, relatively slight little fella, but even then I can hide behind them. Really, really cool. So, next slide. Yeah. But that was just the kelp. I mean, there's absolutely just a riot of colour and shapes and sizes of seaweed on the Great Southern Reef. And really the same way you think about your plants in the garden and all the different textures and sizes and colours, again, it's pretty much mirrored underwater. We've got these crazy kind of like fern, tuft-like greens, these really beautiful pearl-like ones. You can actually eat. These ones actually taste quite a lot like cucumber. There's restaurants in Southern Australia, Melbourne, Hobart at the moment, making gin and tonics out of them with them as a garnish. Sea lettuce, you can eat that stuff, really delicious. This crazy one, I mean, it just looks peculiar, right? But I find it particularly interesting because that is a single cell. So these are some of the largest single cellular organisms in the world. Occur in the Great Southern Reef, occur throughout our waters. Crazy, like almost bright pink concrete. And some of these very inconspicuous looking species are some of the most important. The abalone particularly, like the settle on these. And they really they cement a lot of our reefs together, and they provide a lot of the base kind of foundation and the structure for a lot of the reef. And you'll see in many places that these pink coralline algae are just widespread. They occur every single nook and cranny in the But again, a whole bunch of different shapes and sizes and colours, and really, really spectacular environment to work with. So I mentioned I'm going to focus really on the kelp forest today, but the Great Southern Reef is comprised of lots of different habitats actually. In the same way, again, the barrier reef, the coral there gets all the attention. There's seagrass, there's mangroves on the Great Barrier Reef. It's exactly the same in the Great Southern Reef. You've actually got all these different habitat types that are interconnected. You know, you will get nutrients or fish that maybe spend part of their life or spend some time in the seagrass, and then they'll move out to the kelp forest, or they spend time in the mangroves and then they move out. So we've got obviously kelp forest. We've got these. If you go a bit deeper from the kelp forest, where the light starts to fade a little bit, it ends up getting taken over by a lot of invertebrates, sponges and sea lips. These incredibly rich. You can see the amount of fish there. Again, that's not really an unusual sight. Shellfish reefs. Something that has been massively decimated really across the country. We've lost about 99.99% of our shellfish reefs. They were actually the first fishery in Australia. They're also the first fishery that collapsed in Australia in the 1800s still. Seagrass habitats, like I said, salt marsh, mangroves, even these melaleuca swamps in parts can be really connected to our coastal environment. They're tidal, they're fluffed with salt water. And really what happens in one of these habitats, it can flow on and affect all of them. So it's really useful to think about this system is really interconnected. And what happens in your salt marsh can certainly affect your seagrass, which then might affect a kelp forest down the coast and vice versa. Next one. Yeah, but like I said, I'm really going to focus mostly on the kelp forest today, but we can talk more about and answer questions about any of these. And yeah, I've got a little bit of other stuff as we move on. So kelp forests, these incredibly productive and biodiverse ecosystems occur around the world in cold waters, but even in kind of semi-subpolar. So a lot of our subantarctic islands, Maborium stuff, has really beautiful kelp forests. And they occur in the northern hemisphere as well. And they're actually increasing and expanding into the Arctic with climate change, which is a problem because obviously the Arctic has its own really special ecosystems, and we're seeing this march of kelp into that environment. The real kind of, important fact, of kelp is that they create that habitat. Obviously, you can't have a forest without trees. You can't have a kelp forest without kelp. So if you didn't have the kelp there, you lose all of that structure. You lose all of that life, that habitat, that food. And that has really big implications for everything else that lives in that environment. Literally, the tens of thousands of other species of plants and animals that live in those environments, generally speaking, don't occur outside of kelp forests. So if you lose those one or two species of kelp, the implications across the environment are really, really very massive. Next one. Again, not only really environmentally important, and I personally value the environmental stuff, that's the top of my list, that's the top of the importance, but that's not everyone's position, and that's fine. They are also incredibly economically important for what we call the services, the ecosystem services they supply. So they're the foundation, like I said, they're all of that habitat. So they're the foundation of our coastal food webs and our coastal fisheries, incredibly important for economies and coastal industries, especially in places like the South Coast. Really important for nutrient cycling and cleaning up and maintaining the health of our water. We have to replace our kelp forest with water treatment plants. We would be spending tens of billions of dollars to do that, whereas we've got our seaweed out there that's doing the forest for free. There's some evolving work looking at whether or not they can help with coastal defence or protection. So in some areas, some types of kelp might be able to lessen storm swell, for example, or minimise erosion, which might be particularly interesting with rising sea levels and climate change. There's a lot of hype at the moment around kind of seaweed carbon and carbon sequestration and kelp kind of saving the world and solving climate change. Unfortunately, that's really something that's massively overhyped, and we can talk about it more later on. Certainly the science isn't out there to say one way or another, but it's very much an evolving space. But the science, the best available science that is available at the moment says that it's going to be very variable, but it's probably relatively limited. But again, it doesn't really matter because that's really just the cherry on top. There are so many other incredible reasons why we need to protect and conserve our kelp forest that the carbon thing doesn't really matter. Fortunately, just like the Great Barrier Reef, the Great Southern Reef is also under threat, and particularly the kelp forest, the Great Southern Reef. Depending on where you are in the country, urbanisation and pollution are a real problem. Places like Sydney and Adelaide have lost a lot of their kelp forest due to urbanisation and pollution. We see changing oceanography, which is in Tasmania causing an increase, and Victoria as well, causing an increase in sea urchins as they're riding this East Australian current south. You might be familiar with the EAC, the East Australian Current from Finding Nemo, the current the turtles surf on. That's actually increasing in strength with climate change, and it's moving further south. And the EAC is a warm, nutrient-poor current. We bring all that warm, nutrient-poor current to places like Tassie, Victoria, Southern New South Wales, and displacing the water here that more historically was a lot colder and a lot more nutrient-rich, and that has big impacts. We're obviously seeing ocean warming as well and marine heat waves on top of it. So the same way we can have kind of hot times of year on land and then a heat wave on top of it. The same thing happens underwater. And we're seeing a lot of kind of those sea urchins are causing problems in certain places where they overgraze the kelp. And that might be because they're moving because of climate change or population. So a lot of my work in the last few years especially has been focused on habitat restoration. Can we use all of this ecological knowledge we have in kelp forest to actually go out and intervene and manage them and help kind of stop some of those losses and even get some forest back where we used to have them but we've lost them. But a really important kind of component of habitat restoration is you have to overcome that initial driver of decline, that initial reason you lost the habitat in the first place. So use the analogy again of forest on land. If a forest on land is being logged, for example, and you want to go and restore that forest and plant some seedlings in it, no point doing that if the logging activities are continuing, right? Because you haven't overcome that initial reason of the loss of those trees. It's the same with any habitat restoration, whether or not it's on land or in the ocean. So I mentioned that a lot of the reason we're losing the reasons we're losing kelp in Australia is climate change. And obviously that's not really something we can actually solve in the short to medium term. Obviously it requires action right now, but due to the delays and the lags built into the system, it's something we're going to be dealing with at least for a while longer. So that creates a really tricky problem when we're trying to overcome that and kind of enact climate change, because we have to handle climate, when we're trying to enact habitat restoration, we have to get a handle on climate change at the same time. Next one. Oh yeah, I just said that. Next one. So this kind of segues into a little bit of work I've been doing in Tasmania. There's a lot of eyes on places like Tasmania and also Southeast Australia because we're actually a global ocean warming hotspot. We're warming here about 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. And we've already experienced change here that other places will see in the next 10, 20 years. So in some ways, we're actually a window into the future. So there's a lot of eyes internationally on places like the south coast of New South Wales, Victoria and Tassie, to how we're going to respond to this massive challenge of climate change, because we're kind of, the guinea pigs, unfortunately, and other people are really hoping to learn from our lessons and apply them to their situation in the coming decades when they start to experience those really significant impacts from climate change as well. And one of the great or unfortunate iconic species of climate change, especially in Australia, especially on the Great Southern Reef, is giant kelp. Like I said, it can grow massively tall. It's more like an underwater jungle than an underwater forest, with like the vines and the lianas. It's so thick in places you can't swim through it. It's like swimming in this underwater mud. It's a really incredible environment. So unfortunately, the next one, Libby. Unfortunately, over the past kind of 50 to 60 years, we've lost about 95% of giant kelp forests in Tasmania. And that's due to ocean warming and that climate change and that extension of the East Australian current into Tasmania. And what happens is the kelp literally melt away. They require that cool, nutrient-rich water. And when we don't have that, when it's influenced instead by the EAC water, those giant kelp just melt away. Particularly in summer, which makes sense, that's when water temperatures get highest. So we're getting this really kind of boom and bust at the moment where we'll get some of our giant kelp back during the year, and summer comes, we can lose most of it. And then we get a little bit back the next year, we lose most of that again. And over time, like I said, we've lost 95% giant kelp. There would have been days, or there were days, and we've heard stories from people that, the same age as people in this room at the moment, where bays that were so thick with giant kelp, you couldn't drive a boat through it. They actually formed this floating canopy on some. You used to have to cut a channel through it because it's so big. Now those bays look like this, not a small giant kelp left, but it's still looking. So really, those losses are something that have happened over people's lifetimes, well within people's lifetimes. Really pretty scary, staggering losses. So obviously that provides quite a challenge for our restoration efforts. How do we overcome those problems of temperature and climate change in our restoration efforts? So what we kind of looked at is, well, the remaining 5% of giant kelp, are there potentially some individuals left that might be naturally more tolerant of warm water? So we went and sampled across the length of Tasmania at these 6 different sites in northern Tasmania, which is the warm part, obviously, southern Tasmania, where it's cooler. It's non-destructive. Giant kelp have a special leaf at the bottom of the plant. You just pick it off. Kelp have a weird life cycle, a little bit like ferns. So I don't know if you've ever flipped over a fern, they have the brown dots underneath. That's very similar. So the ferns release spores and the kelp release spores as well. So we took that special leaf, took it back to the lab, we can release the spores in the lab, and we can actually generate these cultures, a little bit like you might have a kombucha or a yogurt culture at home. We have kelp cultures in the lab that are persistent, that grow. They just, by keeping them under red light, however, they don't mature. So we don't have this like little shop of horrors of giant kelp coming out of the lab. They stay at that microscopic life stage, and it means that this resource, both as a form of genetic conservation, losing more of that kelp every year, it's important to set aside what we've got and protect it. But it's also a resource that we can go back to and experiment on to look at whether or not some of these individuals might be more tolerant. So what we did very quickly is just we tested a whole bunch of them in the lab when they're still at the microscopic life stage. See the baby giant kelp here. That one's probably about less than a centimetre long. But you can see each of the single leaves here is a single giant kelp. They tend to cluster together. We tested them in our lab to see whether or not some of them could grow at higher temperatures. We tested them at a range of temperatures, like I said, and obviously those individuals that grow best, that's an indication that they're more tolerant to water. So we found about 15% of the 50 or 60 kelp that we tested were naturally more tolerant to warm water. So the same way some humans are naturally taller than others, some giant kelp, it seems, at least in Tasmania, are just naturally more tolerant to warm water. Interestingly, that wasn't related to the site or the region they were from. So the giant kelp we collected from the north of Tassie, the warm part of Tassie, were actually no more warm tolerant. And some of the most warm tolerant kelp we found were from the cool parts of southern Tasmania, and they were tolerant to temperatures 5-6 degrees above what they ever experienced naturally. So that's very peculiar. There's obviously some inbuilt genetic potential, I guess, for these kelp, rather than it being, an acclimation, a training thing. They're obviously not growing in these hot environments. They have some inbuilt genetic capacity. So we then went back to our cultures in the red room, tracked those individuals that we knew were more warm tolerant. We grew them up again in really large quantities, and we actually planted them out at 3 different sites. Relatively small sites, probably about the size of this room, maybe a bit smaller, 150 square metres. And we planted hundreds of them. We drilled them in underwater. We planted them on these plates. This is actually a plate here with thousands and thousands of baby giant kelp on it. Basically that, but on a plastic plate. We drilled them in using an underwater cordless drill, one of my favourite bits of equipment. We used to have to use big hydraulic or pneumatic drills. It's much easier to be able to take a cordless drill underwater. And we planted them out. First time it's really ever been done in Australia, especially with any kelp that have been selected from the lab to be more warm tolerant. They started really well, and after about 1.5 years, I'll show you some photos in a tick, they looked really, really good. But then over that time, they kind of slowly declined, and after about 2.5 years, which is now, they were planted in kind of late 2020. After 2.5 years now, there's only about 20 surviving adults and only 2 sites. The 3rd site we planted at just actually fell over straight away, so we didn't start strong, I should clarify. It was always the most challenging site. It's quite far up a harbour, quite far up the bay. There was a lot of sedimentation, a lot of maybe already human activity there. So unfortunately that site didn't work, but that's fine. This is all part of science, trial and error. So 2 sites with about 20 survivors left. The average size is about 2 metres. The maximum size at the moment is about 6 metres. But when they were happy in that early first year and a half, they reached the surface. They reached 10 metres tall in a year. So they were growing a metre a month, which is really pretty incredible. And really exciting for us now is the plants are also reproductive, because that's the real secret to restoration. It's not about me going out and planting all these different generations of giant kelp. What you actually want to do is kickstart the natural life cycle, really. And so we want the kelp that we plant to become mature and to release their own kelp to naturally start having babies and seeding the reef. Yep. Already said that. Cool. Yes, and one of these sites, which is really exciting for us, was installed and being restored, and the science happening there was being done in collaboration with a local Indigenous Tasmanian group called the Weeguna Aboriginal Corporation. They actually selected the site for us. They obviously have a really, really long social and cultural history stretching millennia back of giant kelp forest in this very specific bay. Unfortunately, they also have obviously that knowledge and that memory of the loss. So they went out and said, look, there's a really good reef here. It had giant kelp relatively recently. We think that'd be a good spot to make it. And actually, from a long while, it was the best site we've had. They've now kind of evened up over that 2.5 years. So after 1.5 years, this is what some of those areas look like. So from 2 millimetre tall kelp, we got these big plants. And again, you can start to see in places they start to look a little bit like giant kelp forest. Small steps, but that's really a lot of what restoration is about. You have to start small and kind of build a platform You have to crawl before you walk, before you run. So that was really exciting for us, and to also see the kelp becoming reproductive. And now, just before last Christmas, which feels like just recently, but now I realise it was we started to see actually natural giant kelp babies popping up on the reef as well. So we had finally closed that cycle. You know, there weren't hundreds and hundreds of them, there were kind of 50 to 60 of them, but that's really exciting again. Again, that's the first time anyone has really seen that. So again, building on that platform of success, we then went and a big group of us, a really kind of collaborative project at the University of Tasmania, where I'm still based. I just work remotely now, despite living in Birmingham. I don't have to commute to Hobart every day, thankfully. But a big team of us, also in partnership with a local dive business and a local seaweed company, planted an area of 7,000 square metres. So initially those areas were 150 metres, you'll remember. Now we've moved to the next forest scale. The 7,000 square metres we planted just about this time last year, and we also actually, or the team went out last week and replanted it because, like I was saying earlier, the giant kelp started really strong and then slowly declined. So what we learned from that is you probably need multiple rounds of planting at a site before it's going to become stable. So we've gone back and replanted it within a year. So hopefully we've got multiple generations there to give the patch and the site a little bit of resiliency. We're also testing a lot of different methods for how you might plant giant kelp. We've moved away from the plates. The plates were really just an experimental kind of method for us. We knew it was never going to work at scale. So we started moving towards seeded twine, where instead of the kelp growing on those little plastic plates, they grow in the lab initially on seeded twine, and then we go out and we wrap that twine around existing seaweed, other kelp, rocks, for example, and then it grows from that. We're also exploring gravel at the moment, I think green gravel, which has got quite a lot of attention in restoration circles, but unfortunately it doesn't really work. The gravel in our part of the world and here as well, it moves around too much and it rubs off its baby kelp, which makes sense. And again, that's a foundation for the next steps. And TNC, the Nature Conservancy, which some of you might be familiar with, a really big kind of multinational environmental organisation, are moving into kind of the next stage again, where they're doing 10,000 square metre patches of multiple places across Tasmania, building on a lot of the work that we've done so far. So this is a little bit more broad now. We'll move into some of the other habitat restoration stuff, and I'll wrap up quickly because I know I'm close to time. But, you know, there's a whole bunch of, you know, restoration isn't just about the ecology and the environment. Really, it's about people, right? We're restoring these environments due to the impacts we've had, but we're also restoring them because we want, you know, it might just be a place to dive, it might be the fish they attract, it might be just the pleasure of having them. So community consultation and support are really essential, and I think we all need to get together and start to discuss, well, what type of top forest do we want in the future? You know, in Tasmania, are they happy if they lose their, or are they okay, I guess, if they lose their giant kelp and it gets replaced by another species of kelp? It's still native to Tasmania, it just doesn't form those big tall forests. Or here, you know, if we lose our golden kelp, it gets replaced by another species, potentially overseas maybe. Are we happy with that? You know, these are all the type of discussions that the community at large need to be involved in and need to be part of. You know, it's not really about just scientists sitting in their labs doing this. It really is a community project. Restoration has to be informed, obviously, by the best available science. We really need to better understand that kelp forest, a lot of that fundamental ecology. What are we aiming towards? What are we actually trying to restore? And also, what was the baseline of the system? You know, what was this naturally like 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? And are we going to aim for that again? Or maybe the kelp forest of 100 years ago, are they going to be too different to the future that we're going to face now because of climate change? Maybe we need to be a little bit more pragmatic and think about what are we really aiming for? And maybe, you know, we need to start getting out there and collecting those spores from our local giant kelp and developing a bit of a seed bank here for genetic conservation. And like I've said several times, you know, it's about crawling before we're walking, before running. I'd say in the Tasmanian giant kelp space, we're kind of just transitioning from crawling to walking, but globally, that's pretty much where kelp restoration is in general. Like, it's a really very, it's a field that's very much in its infancy. Cool, I'll just fly through these. So there's a whole bunch of other restoration projects happening across the Great Southern Reef. There's, like I said, the big Nature Conservancy one kicking off in Tasmania. There's some really awesome shellfish stuff happening across the Great Southern Reef, including at Merimbula Wharf Inlet. That's also the Nature Conservancy. Operation Crayweed's based in Sydney, restoring a species of kelp called crayweed. The crays love to live in it. They lost a lot of that because of pollution. They've fixed the pollution problems. They've overcome that initial reason of habitat loss. And now they're going in and replanting giant kelp. Provid in Sydney. They're doing a similar thing with seagrass and Lake Macquarie around Sydney. Some really cool salt marsh restoration. Again, remembering that the Great Southern Reef has all these interconnected habitats. Again, across the Great Southern Reef, but two really nice ones in the cold parts of Australia, in Tassie and South Australia. Some really neat kelp urchin restoration stuff happening in Merimbula, which is nice. Stuff I can pretty much like walk down to my local beach and be like, that's where there's some cool research happening. And also some really nice kelp urchin stuff here, which I won't talk too much about because there's far more qualified people to talk about that. Cool. I think the next one is just a wrap up, but I mean, I've mentioned a lot of this already. The Great Southern Reef really is this incredibly spectacular environment. We need to start managing and restoring and understanding this environment, but that has to be done. That restoration has to be informed by the best available science and in collaboration with the community and traditional owners. It's this very much kind of iterative, repeatable, holistic process about all these interconnected habitats. There's really no silver bullet for restoration. I think that's kind of a really important point, is no one has the solution. You know, we have to have all these different things working in tandem. We have to improve our water quality. We have to, you know, maintain our fisheries health. We have to have stable and healthy economies. We have to go and replant kelp in places. So it's this concerted effort. It's not just one thing that's going to help us solve the problem. There's a whole bunch of talk at the moment about this restoration economy. You know, restoration on land is a lot more, I guess we're all familiar with that, but in the ocean, not so much. But there's a real potential for councils potentially to have teams that are going out and replanting kelp on a regular basis and, you know, working with industry and working with potential seaweed industries to supply the kelp nursery, or working with abalone or urchin industries as a way to kind of, again, this really connected ecosystem. And yeah, really promising so far, but much, much more work to be done. I think that's it. Cool. So just very briefly, we released this kelp restoration guidebook last year. It's completely free. If you just Google kelp restoration guidebook, you'll get it. It's global. It's the first global guidebook for kelp restoration, and the idea is it's a little bit of a tool for local communities. It doesn't necessarily have all the answers, but it gives you a really nice starting platform for you to go and say, okay, we want to do X and Y here. We want to, you know, test out some different approaches. So I just thought I'd plug that as, and now I do think that's it, I promised. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Definitely, certainly not just me. There's a whole big range of people across Australia, across Tasmania, internationally that work on this. And also really thankful for everyone who came today and also the organisers. Yeah, really happy to be here. Like I said, quite full circle for me. It's tight fitting on. Thank you.
You're back.
And I'll be around for questions like we said later. If anyone's interested.
Thanks very much, Kane. That was brilliant. I don't know if I could on there. And it's interesting to see that people are moving together in the same sort of way to try and do the same sort of thing all around the country and globally. Now we've got a couple of quick presentations. Chris is going to make a presentation from the fisherman's point of view, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Atlas of Life. Then Nick will talk to us about the science that we're engaged in here.
John.
So,
John.
sorry?
Then John.
Oh, John, yes, I've forgotten. John's coming in the middle of that. What I'd suggest is that when John's finished his presentation, maybe that's a good time to take a quick break, and you can have coffee and what have you for a few minutes before Nick comes and talks about the science. So I'd like to introduce Chris Young, who's a life member and secretary of the Merimbula Big Game and Lakes Angling Club. He graduated from Sydney University in Geology and Geophysics and followed a career in mineral exploration, management and business development as company director. But as a retired and he first consummate angler, Chris joined the large group of Luderick anglers that frequent the Merimbula Wharf, mostly visitors from Melbourne. But in recent years, and with no commercial catch, they noticed a distinct reduction in the amount of Luderick caught, commensurate with the observation of a distinct increase in urchin numbers and development of a barrens environment. And in response to that, Chris has become active and authored a submission to the Recreational Fishing Trust to enable a cull of the urchins. And the wonderful thing about Merimbula Wharf is you can go out and you can actually see down into the water. You can see what's going on to a certain extent. but now we're actually getting in there and doing it. So Chris Young from the Anglers Big Game and Lakes Angling Club.
Good, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And Libby's given half of my talk, which is really, really good. I'm overwhelmed from Carl's presentation, absolutely overwhelmed. But here I want to focus in on just around the wharf. Now, this is what the reason we're here is that us local anglers noted a dramatic change in the amount of weed that we could see. Stephen Nimmo here was one of the first that belted me on the back and said, Chris, we've got to do something about this. And we got together and the club put in an application. This is the wharf. The wharf itself is a fishing platform, designated as a fishing platform in 1983, probably one of the first in New South Wales. Next. Now, this is it. This is why we were here. We were catching fish. And all of a sudden, over the years, we saw more and more sea urchins, less and less weed, and less fish. Now, the Tourist Bureau tells us that 40% of the tourism here in Merimbula is angling related. Get rid of the fish and you're going to lose a lot of money from our tourist industry. So what is the problem? These are three things that were noted. One, people out in boats have seen less weed. Where we fish with lubric, we've seen less weed, less fish and more sea urchins. And anglers from interstate. Next. Now here's a photograph. You can see the barrens developed around the wharf. And this is what this project's working on, which is reducing the number of sea urchins, measuring how the weed goes. Next. I think this is a very important photograph because this is a stainless steel ladder on the wharf. You can all go down and look at it yourself. And it shows weed happily regrowing out of reach of the sea urchins. Thank you. We had some hurdles. We started this off in 2019. It took us 2 years to get the permit to allow us to dive out the sea urchins. So what was the reason? It appears to me, from my own reading, that the powers that be and the academics, Sydney in particular, have this steady state theory that everything's wonderful. We've got patches of barrens and we've got patches of weed. And that's the way life is. So why should we issue a licence for people to cull the sea urchins? Well, it's a lot different down here in the southern areas. In southern New South Wales, eastern Victoria, Tasmania, the local weed is diminishing rapidly as the number of urchins are increasing. Recreational harvesting is a wonderful thing. I mean, we're all going, most of us are going to taste some of these urchin roes shortly. Recreational harvesting can help reduce the number of sea urchins. But that's only a drop in the ocean, as we say. Go back to that one, please. I suppose really what I wanted to say here was that the steady state theory around Sydney, based on academic studies in the last 50 years or so, probably doesn't recognise recreational harvesting of the sea urchins. which probably started strongly after the post-war Italian immigration. Now, I didn't always look like this. When I was younger, I was actually a surfer around Cronulla Beach. And 70 years ago, I personally saw the recreational harvesting of sea urchins. 70 years ago. Thank you. Next. Towards better management policy, this is the local commercial harvester. He actually came in here into our study area and had a little bit of a look-see. He says, our own experience, this is the words from the recreational harvester, our own experience have shown that reducing urchin densities not only helps the reef recover, but improves the roe quality. In other words, the best roe is where the sea urchins are actively chewing into the weed. They get nice, juicy roe. When you've got the barrens, and the sea urchins on the barrens, they're not commercial. So it's a double negative. Where urchin barrens once dominated the underwater landscape, we now see a flourishing weed habitat. And this is here where we are, where we've done our cull. I think John will tell us the numbers, but with some thousands sea urchins being taken around the wharf, and we can physically see the weed regrowing right now. Wonderful. This is what Nick's going to tell us all about. Next. Well, I've actually finished most of what I want to say. The objective is to document the natural succession of the algae following the urchin reduction. We're done with 5 minutes.
That's pretty good.
Because I can show you a couple more quickly. This is one of our friendly teammates. We call him Stumpy for some reason. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yes. So there are lots and lots of people who have a different interest in the wharf and the area around here on the coast. And for the last 10, 12 years, I've been working with a project called the Atlas of Life. And what we do with this is we try and encourage people to get into nature and to record what they're seeing, because we know that things are changing quickly with climate change. And this is such a special part of the world that the more records we have of what's here and what's moving through the landscape, the better it is, the more help we can be to scientists, and the more pleasure we get from being out in nature and enjoying it. And I've got a particular interest in the coastal environment. I'm very keen on nudibranchs. So every year we run a sea slug census around the area and try and get everybody to have a look at that. But we do bio-blitzes and we do various things. But the most important thing we do is to record what we're actually seeing. And we put all our observations down into iNaturalist, which is a global biodiversity recording platform. And you can see on here, there's Merimbula, here's the long point, and you can see all of the different records that we've got here. And if you click on any one of those, Nick would like to have a blue one, that's going to be a marine thing. So if you go into there, you can actually see any of the things that are there. If you've got a particular interest in nudibranchs, you can search, say, nudibranchs, or if you want to see where it's recorded, you can put in Luderick and you can see all the records there. So this is what we do. This is why we were interested in being part of this collaborative project, because our people who contribute to this are in the water, snorkeling and diving, with the help of Jade from Dive Eden, and we'd like to congratulate her on the birth of her son Dylan a few days ago. So we've got people who come as visitors, but we've got lots of local people who are really interested. And having the wharf here is a really brilliant thing, because we'll go around that. It gives us a fixed focal point where we can find things over the wharf. So that's why our people got involved with this project, and why we think it's important we should collaborate with people to learn more about what's in our own space and what's happening. So we're delighted with that. Now, it is about 11 o'clock. John, do you want to talk now, or do you want to wait till people have had their coffee? If anybody would like to have a coffee, that's fine. And if you're happy to stay here, then that's fine also. I'll introduce John. He was supposed to give me a bio, but he hasn't. But I've known John for a long number of years. And he started off his career as a geography teacher. Correct me if I'm wrong, John, but he came to this area and loved surfing. So presumably thought, what can I do with surfing? What can I do in the coast here? And became an abalone diver. And he's been interested in science all the way through. I've talked to John 20 years ago when he was involved with scientists doing research on feeding abalone in Twofold Bay, and I know that he's been interested in the urchin research for a long time as well. So I'd like to introduce him to talk to you from his very particular perspective about what he knows about urchins and whether they're natural, whether they're not, what we should do about them. John, well...
They're going to do it now.
Well, nobody's moved, so yes, you've got to catch the audience.
Thanks for the weekend. I don't know, I'm going to get that.
What's up?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's what happened. Started abalone diving, one of the first things I noticed, of course, was this sparrow habitat that we've been talking about today, and it just, immediately got me thinking. We've been downstop reef surfing and had my mum spend hours picking it out of her backside and stuff like this. But I'm coming to the conclusion now that the best way to reduce the urchin density is actually weeding. So we're starting to see now that rather than a problem in New South Wales, we've got an opportunity to develop sea urchin fishery. And now we've been hearing a lot about it lately as well, but this has been happening for quite some time. And so we go on to the next slide. So it's these guys we're talking about, long pine, second steppings, Roger's like very common around here. And Chris might see this interesting because this was some of the old slides we've dug up. You ponder the question, were they, was this our natural habitat when the first completed, like we created barren habitat by removing predators such as lobsters or abalone or other species? But this was taken before the abalone was developed, the starters off Cape Back around the Cronulla area. Not a really good slide, but old aerial photograph showing that was actually occurring back, in the 30s, 40s, 50s. There was an increase in balance. We've done a fair bit of like anecdotal type stuff with prey fishermen, especially in the inshore reef, noticing that some reef have disappeared. Your talk came was very interesting because when I first started diving in the 70s, on Cape Howe and on the next reef across Salt Lake, we had that mackerel growing to the surface and you swim around underneath it in a giant forest. And that was gone in a few years back in the 70s. So we have seen changes. And there's been other people looking at this, and this is some old research we dug up back in the 60s, MacArthur and Levins. They noticed the grazing pattern of the sea urchins. Farmers would talk about fine grazing sheep that crop the, crop the grass right down to the bare sand, as opposed to, of course, the grazing cattle from town. Sea urchins are like that. The purple ones are anyway. They graze it right down to the rock. So their suggestion in their research was, by removing sea urchins, you'll get a re-establish the algae growth. Okay? So they've seen that back in the 60s. And then in the 70s, Scoresby Shepherd was a very active abalone research scientist in South Australia. And he was over here doing work on Gabbo Island. And some of his early research on the island and pointing to New South Wales was that the centrus definite replaced the abalone from large areas, because the seaweed's gone, habitat's gone, the abalone gone. And even Jacques Cousteau's somebody came out and said that was taken up in Seal Rocks. But so we've had this barren habitat in New South Wales for a long time. So we started fishing the sea urchin and a Japanese processor, and through the next slide, and we started taking a fair bit of anchor urchin, loading those little boats, and that went on for 2 years, and it was unprofitable for the Japanese fella. He went over to California, and his son's still operating the plant over there, and he was able to develop, working with the Californians, the development of that fishery. The reason why he could succeed in California and not New South Wales was that he could get a lot more money for the higher quality urchin he got in California, which was very similar to the Japanese urchin, but it had a completely opposite season. So when the Japanese local urchin went off, born, they had to buy it from California. So we've been talking about this a long time amongst the divers, and in the 80s, we had a marine biologist in the department working for us, Gary Hamer, and we pointed out, we had discussions about the urchins. So we cleared an area down near Merimbula, south of Eden, 2 square metres, and he built a big cage and sit it on the bottom, and so it's about 2 or 3 metres by 2 or 3 metres. We closed this area off. Didn't seem to be very long before you could go into the cage. You couldn't see through it, the weed grew back. And then went to full through. And then big storm came along and knocked the cage off, and the other urchins came in and they got the seaweed. But it showed us something. So one processor began in earnest in New South Wales, up in Batemans Bay. And here we are loading in Eden, once again, bags, day after day. Now off the Haycock, had my boat working out there. And this was the factory. Now this is the problem with the sea urchin fishery. It's not like a lot of fisheries where you can just put the fish on the market and they sell. There's a massive human element and very labour intensive processing the urchins, and that's just one section of the pack. The urchins we're going to eat today come from South Coast Sea Urchins up here in Bandon, and it's nothing to go into that factory where you've had one diver working for the day. I see 20, 30 people all taking, carefully removing the roe, ending up with a finished product. But this was focusing on exporting, and it failed. So then we had another researcher notice, had a swim around southern New South Wales, Nation, Tasmania, And he pointed out that the barons were increasing and the urchins seemed to be, more and more eating grease. But he made that observation. If the urchin fishery could be profitable, then the reduction of the urchin fishery might be achievable. Next slide. So that prompted us to do more research in the 90s. We got Dr. Neil Andrews over back to Australia, and we covered areas just south of Eden. We left some areas alone. We transplanted young abalone stuff, and we watched the results. So we were involved in this research in terms of just killing urchins. And sometimes in not big areas, but small bays, we try and remove every urchin to figure out what happened. And this is what Neil found. It's most obvious change was the seaweed comes back and everything else associated with the whole biodiversity. And there was a reported increase in the abundance of fauna supported by these ecosystems, what we were interested in, the abalone. So abalone was coming back into these bays, and it was coming back in at a far greater rate where we helped them as well. And then that led to some more research. Started thinking about the markets. And so we got to Blount and Worthington and a few others looking at how, we could develop the fishery commercially. And I'll go on to the next one. Now this is very telling. This is part of their research. The top row is typical of the row in an urchin farm habitat. They're not getting any food, and so their rows have the habitat they're in. Whereas by thinning it out, 5 out of 3, you don't take all the urchins, you thin it, and you're getting urchin row that's tasty and marketable. That was key to that research, and in understanding the way that the road is going to develop. And it also taught the divers to get into it. You've got to fish. You've got both habitats out there, so you've got to fish and take the urchin back to the process. And if he's got staff employed $20 an hour, cracking urchin, you're getting that, you quickly go broke. And this is one of the big problems with developing the commercial side of that fishery. So over the time, we've had these shipments to Japan, all from the 70s and the 80s. Yeah, they were the roads. We could pick the nice urchin row coming from merchants really close to the weed, so they're getting well fed. We had a bunch of brand processors in the factory at Nalakuta, so that was already established. They weren't paying rent. They could process at night. That aside, that didn't work. The photo before, the processing plant in Batemans Bay, exporting to Japan. Sure, they liked the row, but it was way down the bottom of the pile. It wasn't getting the pricing. It would make the whole process viral. It wasn't until 2000 where the company that's operating this still, South Coast Sea Urchins, started, and they were Kiwis. And they recognised that Maori particularly loved urchins. So they started making a kinnipack. And it's just urchin roe in brine, not what you call A grade, B grade product. But the Maoris loved it. And they were shipping urchin roe to Mount Isa and the mines and Port Hedland and the ports, Brisbane and Melbourne and all around Australia. And that became the core of their business. But the more they processed and the more they continued to harvest these areas, they were starting to get more A grade. So now they're producing both A grade for the sashimi quality for the top end restaurants, and the kinnipacks for the Maoris. So for 20 years, this is the 100-tonne mark. and that's 2020. We plodded along South Coast sea urchins. In 2009, another company started up in Payments Bay with sea urchin harvest, and then on the same thing, making impacts. This is where we got to in 2020, just over 100 tonne of urchin, which is really a brick in the ocean, because we have done some estimates of biomass. There's a lot of urchin there. But anyway, we'll go on to the next slide. And this is what's happened in the last 3 years. We've crept up over 100. And this year, just 30th of June, we actually went up to 235 tonne. So a lot more people are eating sea urchin. Both factories have got an export licence now, but that product has all gone into the domestic market. So basically, we've got a commercial fishery. We've got the management structure in place, even though it's been in for 30 odd years. We've got the restricted tradable licences and things like that. We do have other species we can catch which are quoted, but there's no quota at this point on the centros. We can catch turtle shell, but we mainly catch that in the northern part of the fishery. But all the tools we use for management of the abalone fishery, and I'm talking management tools, but also the tools such as our boat or equipment we use, can be used in both fisheries. So we've got the whole state marked off for spatial management and reporting. We use data loggers in all our boats, so you can get really good time information on where and how much you're catching. So where are we going? There has been a growth in demand, and we have been involved in a few marketing projects through industry and New South Wales VPI up at Sydney fish markets and different fairs on the coast and so on, and different restaurants, including today, where we've been sponsored to pay for some sea urchins and some abalone if you're staying at lunch. So the urchin row is growing, and it's probably good, the export market could grow as well. It works well with the abalone fishery because, first of all, it's seasonal, and the boats and the divers have similar equipment, and so you could actually dive for sea urchins through the summer, and then when the urchin row spawns, and then catch your abalone. So that works really well. It makes it viable for both the divers and the processors. And it's a tasty seafood. That's just on oysters, but we'll be trying a few different ways today. And we still need to do research. We have done a fair bit in the early days back on the actual biomass of urchin. And once we fish an area, do they move in or do they come in from those barren and occupy the weed? We see anecdotally they do. Thing about me abalone diving around here is I've watched the sea urchin divers where they work, and often work in the same areas. The best areas where the habitat's been covered is where the sea urchin divers have continually worked. So I'm catching abalone now in places off APOC and Merimbula that I've never caught 30 or 40 years ago. Now I'm swimming around in weed beds that just come back because they've not wiped out the urchin, because that's not the name, but they've just reduced the densities enough. So you've not only got the weed, but when they go back and get their urchins, they've got better food growing, and they're viable to process. And so more research maybe on the production techniques, and the row and marketing, things like that. And just to conclude, we've been here a while. A lot of people, small fishery considering, but and we know we've described this white rock or barren habitat for a long time. Starting to see a lot more, as Chris mentioned, people wondering if that's part of the way it always was. It's a bit hard to go back and look at it like 200 years ago. But they're now saying it is part of the New South Wales habitat. That's the discussion going on inside. So that's why they don't want us to just go out, kill. You know, it's fair enough. But with a developing fishery, if it's managed right, you should be able to get balance and get both. Okay, I think I'll finish there. Yep.
Thank you very much, John. That was also fascinating. I think what you're seeing here is the different perspectives about things, and yet we all have the same kind of interest. And this idea of having a sustainable fishery, both for abalone and for sea urchins, and being able to take the urchins from a place where the local recreational fishermen really value the spot, and which gives the local snorkelers and divers a nice place to go, which is easily got at. It seems like a win-win situation if we can do this. And I've been really interested to see how the attitudes have changed and how the management of the fisheries changed over the 20 or more years that I've been here. Now the abalone divers go down with GoPros and they take film of each of the channels where they fish so they can prove that it's a sustainable fishery. These things wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. It was very much a sort of a head-to-head, you can't stop us doing any of this. But now that everybody's realising that if you can have a sustainable fishery and you can have a beautiful environment, that's got to be the best solution. So Nick's going to talk to us about the science that we're engaged in here, the actual project itself. And again, Nick hasn't bothered to give me a bio, so I've known Nick for years and years when he was doing a PhD in Sydney Botanic Gardens on phycology, which is seaweeds. And he's been down here working for a long number of years. We're delighted that he lives in our area. And he's got a successful coastal ecology business. So he's an ecologist primarily, but he's very much a scientist and very much cares about this coastline, the estuaries, the salt marshes, and the coastline here. So I'll ask Nick to talk about the science of the thing.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm representing a group of volunteer guides today that we're working with the abalone sanitation guys and Merimbula Fishing Club. Today we're just talking about really what we're doing, where we're monitoring, and what we're monitoring and how we're monitoring. So just a bit of an update on where we're at.
Just find the screen. Sorry.
So we developed monitoring plan at the commencement of the project, and that was to support the fishery permit application. As has been pointed out, the government didn't really want people doing these trials. We actually have to have a fairly rigorous plan to in order to do the project. So we developed a plan which describes the issue and the collaboration amongst the three organisations. And then within that document, we sort of state our scientific objectives, but we've also got a whole bunch of social objectives as well. The hypotheses that we're trying to sort of address, and then it sets out the monitoring indicators, and then how we're the methods we're using to pull the data. So yeah, so the objectives are pretty straightforward. Obviously, restoring the macro habitat of the shallow subtidal reef to enhance the local biodiversity. We want to document the natural succession of how that community changes once the urchin develops, and basically document other changes in the broader sort of fish community and the sessile and mobile invertebrate community. So that's sort of happening before and after the cull. But also, more importantly, we've got these social objectives, which is basically to improve the recreational fishing opportunities to the fishing club. They want to sort of come down to the wharf and be able to catch a great range of species, and particularly their blackfish as well. The project was sort of conceived to include all aspects of the community. So we've sort of designed it so that it's not sort of focused necessarily just on the diving. There's some sort of data analytical sort of methods that we want to use that get people involved, you know, from your land effectively. We'll talk about that as well. So the hypotheses for this project are that, and it's been sort of demonstrated with other studies, is that you reduce the urchin population, you know, you take out one of the main raisers in the community, and the macroalgae is expected to recolonise and grow in areas where it previously was devoid. Our other hypothesis is that we might see increased abundance and diversity of other species that are associated with macroalgal habitats. And then that perhaps with the increased diversity of fish and their abundance, we may see an increased number of fishermen choosing to fish from the wharf, which is actually built for recreation fishing. So where are we monitoring? We've basically got two sites just here at the wharf, which we're calling our impact site. So that's like, you know, where the impact is actually up. And then we've got a control site, which is slightly to the east, and that's nothing's happening there. We're just monitoring that to sort of understand what natural variation here at Long Point looks like in the seasons. So we've got a reference to compare with what we're seeing here at the wall. So we've sort of developed this plan, you know, along the lines of fairly rigorous sort of scientific approaches, doing a fairly simplified approach. These yellow lines represent our transit surveys. And so what we've got is 2 shallow transits, 2 deep transits at each site. The shallow ones are intended for snorkelers to be able to do, and then the deep ones for people on scuba. So this is just an image of the wharf site and the extent of what we're monitoring. And you can see that there's a patch of kelp here, but largely it's all fairly bare rock. When I say bare rock, there is an algal cover on it, but it's like an encrusting chloride algae. But for all intents and purposes, what we're trying to recreate is the canopy algae. So that's what we'd like to see come back. Next one, thanks. This is the control site just to the east, and you can see the topography is very different. It's quite complex, but this is in terms of our access, it's a perfect control site, but it is very different in terms of topography. So the reef here at the wall's quite flat reef. This is a summary of all the objectives and the indicators and the methods that we're using in this project. Now this is probably a bit too much, but we'll go to the next one, which is a better summary. Basically, we're measuring fish diversity and abundance, and we're doing that in 2 ways. The divers, just through their visual observations, but we're also using a tool called RUV, which is called a baited remote underwater video, and that's being done by the Merimbula Fishing Club. If you want to get involved in those surveys, Chris is the man to talk to. That's like a baited system that's just thrown into the water for a set period of time. The video camera is just recording the fish, and you do the data analysis at home and have a drink, watch the fish video, write the numbers down. We're recording macroalgal percentage cover and diversity. That's probably one of the main metrics for the project. We're also recording the sessile invertebrates, things like the mussels, the sponges, the ascidians, things that the invertebrates that grow on the reef that don't move. And then, of course, one of the main metrics as well is the urchin density. So we're doing that in a couple of ways, where the divers are counting along transit lines in a 1 metre belt. Another method we're using is we've got a couple of really good drone pilots in our group, and they're capturing aerial imagery at the moment every 2 years, and you can see the imagery is unbelievable. The water's been so clear. We sort of they provide a really good method of being able to map, basically map the algae communities as opposed to the bare rock, what we're calling barrens. So this is a method that's being done in other studies, and so it's another method that allows us to do it on a broader scale and track over time any kind of changes. So there's people out there that are handy with GIS and want to get involved in that aspect of the project. There's a bit of work to do there. So for the diving work and the snorkeling, we're collecting our data in a number of ways, storing it in a number of ways. So underwater, we're using this underwater paper, and we're just recording all of our species. This is based on a program called Reef Life Survey, which is it's a fairly major reef assessment method. We've kind of adopted it to fit our project a little bit. So we're measuring all the species listed in this table. And at the bottom of the table, we've got our intervals along our transits where we record the urchin numbers. And we're doing that by looking at all the urchin species, not just the centros. Diver observations are also uploaded to iNaturalist, as Libby mentioned. So it's important to also talk about not just the Centrostephanus urchin of this area. There's a whole bunch of other grazers that also exert pressure on the local ecosystem. And so you've got the pencil urchin, looks like sort of lines from the second wall. It's a very distinctive urchin. The purple and the red urchin, the Helios sedaris. And then we've also got the abalone and then other really large gastropods. So it's important to acknowledge that in this area, obviously the centros are seen as a problem. You have a whole bunch of other elements in the community that we need to sort of monitor and look at their numbers as well. So this gives a bit of an overview of what we've done to date. Got a timeline up the top. Basically, we kicked things off in 2021 when the permit was received. We did a whole bunch of monitoring through 2021 and 2022 before the first cull was undertaken by John and his divers. So we've got a lot of before data, and then the cull happened in November last year, and then there was another cull in May of this year. So you can see where a lot of our data collection effort has occurred so far. So far has been about 245 volunteer diver hours, and that's we've done 9 surveys, and there's been 25 different divers that have contributed so far to the project. So we've done 6 events before the cull, 3 after the cull, and there's plans to do more. Dive Eden supplying all of our air cylinders, great, through funding from the Fishing Club. And then we've had 2 drone aerial imagery events and 3 RUB events. So this gives you a bit of a snapshot on what we've done so far. All volunteer time. So this is a bit of a description on the culls of what's happened. So John first did the east side of the wharf, and he removed close to 11,000 urchins. Then I've got November on both, but that's not correct. It was in May this year that he then removed about just over 2,000 urchins, western side. So this is some of our data that presents what we know about emission density here locally. So the blue bars are the wharf site, the green bars are the control site, and you can see that we've done far more work here at the wharf than we have at the control site. Basically, the red line through the graph shows 50 urchins per 10 metre squared area. So you can sort of, if you wanted to break that down to 1 metre squared, it's 5 urchins So before the cull, we had effectively 60 urchins per 10 metre square block. That's quite a lot. That's 6 per every square metre. You can see that over at the control site, the numbers were a bit more variable because the habitat over there is a bit more variable. So we had 37 on this near side, and then on the further east you go, getting back up around the 60 urchins. And you can see that after John's cull, you've dropped it by about 45%, John, on the west side, which makes sense because you only removed about 3,000. And then you did a much more intensive cull on the east side. It's dropped the population there by about 80%. And so we're getting about 13 urchins per 10 metre square block. So we've gone from 6 to effectively 1 urchin on the east side of the wall. Just to put it into a regional context, John was talking about Neil Andrews and his researchers. This is a graph from their work back in late 90s, which shows the urchin density across southern New South Wales. So I thought I would compare what we have here at Merimbula to the rest of New South Wales. And this here is our local reference. This is Haycock Point on the other side of the bay. And you can see that it was pretty similar. Now, after our most recent data collection event, that the wharf site is well below the 50, but the control site is still up there around the 50. So that's, yeah. And it's, I think it's just good to put that in for context of what we're trying to do. So what have we learned so far? There's a lot of data being collected. We haven't really analysed a lot of it. But we have actually seen some pretty amazing stuff. So we're documenting, obviously, biodiversity. That's what we're most interested in. And this gives you a bit of a summary of the main groups: the algae, the echinoderms, the fishes, the rays and sharks, mollusks. So that's a bit of a summary. It's probably a pretty conservative estimate because, you know, we're just looking at things that are very conspicuous. And Will and the other divers that come here a lot, they really focus a lot on the cryptic things and have some, yeah. So 92 species is probably a massive underestimate. And at times, in the last couple of years, we've been fortunate to see a threatened species pretty regularly. It's the grey-netted shark, which is becoming more regular visitor, which is great for the recreational divers. Just a big animal like that. So this is probably one of the main data tools we've got for this project, is that we're taking photos quite rapidly. So we're building up this big bank of images, which are basically a snapshot in time, and that's what we're using, what we want to use to do a lot of our quantitative analysis, so that we can actually say, we're trying to answer these scientific objectives, you know, as the actually change, as the change. It's hard to say that unless you put some real hard numbers behind it. So what we're trying to do is we'll rely on this data set, and people that want to put their hand up to do it. It's not a tedious thing. It's actually a rigorous scientific method that if someone wants to learn or is interested to learn, we can do as a group. And some of this data will actually be sort of meet scientific standards of what we do in our profession. If you're interested to be involved, we've got lots more diving events planned, and the project will kick off for us 18 months. As I've said before, this is called salmon busting up on the top of the station there. Some dolphins, yeah. So it's actually a pretty fun place to come to dive, and if you're a diver that hasn't been in the water for a long time, Daniel and Jade and Dive Eden can help you there. Certainly for the snorkelers, we welcome you to come and join us.
Very much. So that's an overview of the project as it is so far, but this is intended to be a really long-term project. We'll be doing this for years, hopefully. So there's always a really good opportunity to be involved. Now, before we go to the ROV footage, which you can probably see David down there with all the tickets, I'd like to invite William Harrison-Gray to come and talk about invasive species. I've known Will since he was, and he's been getting in the water and becoming quite a real expert in terms of the water around and the things in it. And you're seeing some of his amazing photographs in a little while. Now, even. But he's likes to actually talk about invasive species, and he works here with the aquariums. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Libby. So yes, my name is William. I'm on the autism spectrum disorder and have a bit of social anxiety, so bear with me. So I'm here to talk to you about the light bulb sea squirrel. Other names go for it are the light bulb tunicate or the light bulb ascidian. I usually just go with light bulb ascidian because I don't know, it's easier for me to remember. Its scientific name is Clavellina lepidiformis, and there is another version, Clavellina obgana. They're both native to the Mediterranean. The best description I can give you of these are, well, they're a colonial ascidian, which you can see. They're all these giant amount of white, and the ascidian is just a simple filter feeder. So they usually form very dense colonies. They're all free individuals, but they are around 2 centimeters tall, but they are connected via a gelatinous stolon or a gelatinous base. Occasionally they're individual, but most of the time they're in a very dense colony. Now, the white you see here can sometimes come in pink or orange, but we haven't seen that yet. And the way they digest food is they inhale food and trap it with various silicas or little hairs, and then they move that into their stomach. Now, it's native to the waters of Europe and the Mediterranean mostly, but it's now found in North America, Asia, Africa, New Zealand, and now Australia. Now, we don't know the extent of this, what this is going to do, because it's very recent. This is just indicted. The best we can do is look at what other countries are saying it will do. New Zealand have said it's going to wreak havoc for the aquaculture industry, so it's going to cause problems for all their oyster farmers, all their abalone farmers, all different sorts of aquaculture, so it will block up any filtration systems as well. Now, another reason it's a problem is it can tolerate conditions most other things can't. It can survive in very poor water quality and even brackish water conditions. So it is pretty indestructible, unfortunately. Now, it will compete for food and space, and it will cover everything and anything, whether it's mackerel, mussels, oysters. So this I've got in the container here was just a clean black mussel that is just completely coated in white, which is the skin. You can have a look at that later. Now, it was first seen locally in Eden Harbour in December of 2019. Then it was first photographed in March next year. But we reported it to the EPI and Biosecurity in 2021. Now, it was just spotted in Merimbula last year. I first saw it under the pub jetty. The most likely way it got, because it can only move via ships. So the most likely way it got here was a ship was docked in Eden for, let's say, 2 or 3 months, and then it came to Eden or back to Merimbula without scrubbing or cleaning or anti-fouling. So it is quite a severe. Now, there are a couple of methods of control, but they're pretty, and I just want to touch on the amount of money Australia spends on their biosecurity. So they spend around $25 billion a year on biosecurity, but only 7 million of that actually goes into marine biosecurity. The rest is all land-based. So we have very little that we're able to actually see and control. Now, the methods of control, there's three that I've been able to find. One is a giant tarp with chemicals. So you find the area, it's invaded, then you put a giant tarp over it, pen it down, and then you pump chlorine in it. Now that will kill that, but it will kill every single thing that's caught under the tarp, whether it's a crab, a fish, seahorse, everything will be killed by it. The other method of controlling it is manual removal, but that has also got its problems because when you remove it, you have to collect up each and every little individual colony. Because if one little piece goes, it can just spread it all over again. And it's also, because of its gelatinous base, you have to collect that as well, otherwise it will just keep growing in the gelatinous base. So it's like just trimming a really aggressive growing plant, it just keeps on coming back. Now, the third one is probably the most labour intensive, but will probably have some of the better results. Coral gardening, or just about twice a week, going to the area, removing it and trying to grow other things there to encourage other marine life to grow there. Now, Eden is quite prolific, I'll say, in the amount of invasive species. So in Eden currently, we've got the European shore crab and the Mediterranean family. Now, I do have photos of the Mediterranean family, and now I just want to point out this photo is actually what the pylon should look like. So there's not a single piece of that white sitting in. And that is another example of healthy. That's our native feather star or feather duster. And this was a dive back in 2021, and it just covered everything. But there are some ways that the general public can help. If you own a boat, regularly clean it and make sure that the fouling is no more than a very thin layer of slime. And even if you do that, do it again, please. This is one of the worst things. That is a single piece of rope that was about that thin, but it was just covered in this stuff. Now that's the native version. As you can see, it's got two little blue dots. Functions almost identical, but I've only ever seen it twice because that's how balanced ecosystems are. Now, another way is you can use anti-fouling paint on the bottom of your boat to make sure less stuff grows on it. Another thing is ensure it's clean before even moving your boat. That's a huge one. And clean and dry any piece of marine equipment. It is essential to do that to make sure it doesn't spread even more than it already has. And inspect for areas of your boat that maintain water. It can get trapped in there. If you've got water in your boat, try your best to get it out. Or if you get home and it's there, close it out and scrub it with vinegar to make sure there's nothing that could be in it. And then check for anything tangled in your equipment. So if it's in your fishing line, anchor rope, make sure you don't bring it home or take it somewhere else. Now, I'm almost finished here, but I just want to say, New Zealand have been battling this pest for the past 4.5, 5 years now, but New South Wales still doesn't register it as a pest on their websites. And I'm kind of quite upset about how aggressive the species is, because I just went to collect that sample today, and it just looks like a white carpet just on the bottom of the ocean. But yeah, thank you for listening.
So, new things coming to visit us all the time. I remember 20 years ago we were doing a project on the green shore crab in Twofold Bay, and we had a researcher from A&U coming, and people were thinking green shore crab would come in with the boats to the Navy Wharf there. But then the researcher from A&U did some tours at Fisher's Beach in the river there, and found green shore crab 150, 180 years ago. So it probably came over with the first fleet. So he's, yes, all sorts of things happening, but if you can do something to halt it or slow it down, that would be good. Right, are we ready to go downstairs?
I think it's Ian here.
Hi, Ian.
Has Dave spoken to you? Has Dave spoken to you? Because he had a catastrophic flood about 40 minutes ago.
I was just checking to see if he maybe fixed it, but sounds like not.
It's catastrophic. As a person who repairs these machines, once the water gets in, as you can imagine, the electrics don't handle it. So he's going to be out of the water. No pun intended.
Okay, well, we might go to Will's rolling slideshow then.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, you can do that. I've got a piece here that I can show you of, but I think people have probably seen urchin barrens well and truly, but that's an urchin barren at Bateman's Bay if they were curious as to what the white rock really ends up looking like. Can you see that in the background there?
Thank you.
See the drummer?
Would you like, Will, would you like to do that slideshow or?
Well, maybe you can talk us through some of the things if that's all right. And we'll ask Dave to come up from the wharf and he can talk to you about what he does with his ROV.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, Dave filmed this here, so he could talk to you about it. There's a couple of shots I've got of some content that Dave filmed.
So I'll go through questions and
okay.
encourage him to come up.
I'll put on Will's images until Dave picks up his.
All right, I'll bring you up onto center screen. Excuse me 1 sec.
Now that was actually the European fan moment that
Sorry, Will.
Hi, Will. How's it going?
it's going really well, thank you.
It's Ian here.
So every photo you're going to see here is actually been caught or photographed off Merimbula Wharf. Where is it all done? There it is. That's a view. So yeah, everything here is local. The marine biodiversity of this area is absolutely incredible. You get some of the smallest creatures, giant cuttlefish, one of my personal favourites. And then, yeah, some of the colours you see are absolutely incredible. There's a little sarcasm. Anglerfish, very fun. That is a beanbag anemone. They're actually about the size of a basketball and they roll around on the ocean floor like a tumbleweed. It's very funny to see. Now, sea pens are probably one of the most confusing creatures we have locally. They don't have eyes, ears, mouth, nose, stomach, reproductive organs, skeleton, digestive system, nervous system, respiratory system. It's just a cluster of cells. This is one of the local wobbegons. There's quite a few. There's one that lives in a cave and you see it almost every night. This is actually a close-up of the type of sea urchin. And this is just one of the many coral wharves we have locally. One of our big friendly breeding orangutans saying hello. And then, yeah, we have beautiful local fan corals that not many people know about because they think corals are tropical. But we have many, many local corals. So here's another one. They're Gorgonian fan corals. They're not a true coral. They're in the octocoral family. But I think they're pretty nice. They're real coral. But yeah, it's really interesting because you can't quite see it, but they've got thousands of little individual creatures that live on them. The entire family is own unique ecosystem. And that's one of my favourites, the little eastern squid boxfish. And then, yeah, some of the shrimp we have here are absolutely incredible in colours. And then that's just another shot of some of the other disciplines. These are little jewel anemones, so they're only actually about that big, but they're super prolific in the shallow waters around here. You know, you can see there, and here, you can see there's a fair bit of seaweed, but not as much as there should be by any means. There's maybe only a couple of tufts, and you can see it's been heavily eaten by sea urchins. Yeah, that's a unique thing. That's a colony of worms. So that was a cluster of feather worms that they feed by filtering food out of the water. Yeah. Very, very interesting stuff. Now, I think they grow, researchers, that is actually one of my favourites. That's an red Indian fish. Very hard to find and quite personally one of my favourite photos. Now, the coral, if my research is correct, I we believe the coral only grows about 5 to 10 millimetres a year. So it's a very, very slow growing coral. But some of the pieces down there, they used to be a bit that big. And that was absolutely spectacular. And then that's one of the Ascidian, or that's a local version of the sea squirt I get on. So some of the sea squirts around here are absolutely beautiful in colour, and yeah, the underwater life around here is absolutely incredible. Quite honestly, I think it's better than the barrier reef, but that's just me personally. But yeah, some of the stuff I get to see, for instance, a couple of months ago, I got to swim with a tiger shark, just locally in the bay here. Then, yeah, I get to swim with grey nurse and all sorts of other things. And yeah, there's never a dull moment here. Yeah. And then I don't have any photos, but the sea slugs here, they look like someone's dropped a gummy worm or something into the ocean. They're that fluorescent in coloration. And then, yeah, the amount of seamoth we have locally as well is incredible. Now, that's a close-up of the feather duster star. And then this is a type of sea anemone we have that only occurs in relatively deep water. And this is another shot of one of our beautiful jewel anemones, but that is actually a type of stone coral. And then the famous blue. But yeah, the photos we get, well, just all the creatures we get locally are incredible. And that is one of the sea stars mentioned. That sea star was about that big. So the sea stars around here are, again, absolutely phenomenal. And yeah, if I wasn't doing this, I'd probably be in the water right now. So yeah.
Thanks.
No worries.
Thanks. It's a complete joy to see your years. Give us some insight into the. I want to introduce Dave to you. Unfortunately, I can't show you on the program, but he can explain a little bit about the work that he does and what he's doing to help us. Because this Dave is from Narooma, and he's come down to stay with us. You're welcome.
I'm sorry about what happened down there. I'm getting over it now. So they had a massive catastrophic leak in the machine. Needs to be rebuilt, so these things happen. So what we do on with Submerged Entertainment Australia, and we do live streaming places for events like this, and we also do it for aged care and for things. Normally it's good, it's the first time this has happened. But I've also done a lot of work on urchin, particularly in Batemans Bay. I've done a lot of mapping and observation for urchin barrens and the other environment. And I'll just show you something that we produce that I think you probably get a lot out of. I go to the web. Yeah, go for it. We go to
Just like naturalists up there, if anybody doesn't know the iNaturalist app and would be interested in learning how to use it, just come and say hello. I'll show you and teach you later on. It's very interesting. Have fun with it. Obviously, if you're underwater, you have to take the images on an underwater camera first and then put them onto your computer before they can go online. But if you've got that, you can make your own journal of all the things that you see and that you're interested in, and it will eventually go up to the Atlas of Living Australia and also the biodiversity information facilities. We're helping to map biodiversity for the world.
Yeah, okay, so this is, if you go to YouTube, go to Undersea ROV, which is who I used to be working for. We did a submission to the Urchin Inquiry, which is a federal, I don't know if people have talked about it today, but it's a Senate inquiry that's going on into urchins right along the coast in New South Wales and in Tassie. And there's been a lot of debate and stuff about whether the urchins are natural, whether the barons are natural. I mean, they're native species, but whether they, because of lack of predators, that there's an explosion in urchin numbers, and we've ended up with the barons that we've had. And this is a presentation we did on the argument, and particularly the argument for loss of predators. And it's quite long, but I think it covers a lot of ground, and we had some really good interviews with experts, global experts, and they've had their say in here as well. And I'll just start it, and you can just see what it's, a flavour of what it's about. And it's all local footage.
This is a macroalgal rocky reef habitat in Bateman's Bay, on the south coast of New South Wales. It is not in the marine sanctuary zone, and recreational fishing is allowed. The kelp and other growth is providing food, cover, structure and building blocks to support a rich web of life, from small organisms to large fish.
So this is all in Bateman's Bay.
Extending from the sea floor to the water's surface and beyond. And as fish in these layers congregate, rest and feed, predators like these yellowtail kingfish and bonito are drawn in to hunt. A few hundred metres away on a rocky reef surrounded by sand, small fish stream in, seeking cover from predators. This rich habitat with fringing kelp is a sessile invertebrate reef, also known as a sponge reef. Sponges, soft corals and other life are rich in colour and diversity, like these slow-growing Gorgonian fans. Sponges, soft corals, social and colonial ascidians, bryozoans, hydroids, seaweeds and more seem to cover every inch of this isolated rocky reef in Bateman's Bay. This diverse benthic life supports a rich web of fish life around and above it. This place is also not a marine sanctuary and is open to recreational fishing. And then nearby are these. These are long-spined sea urchins, Centrostephanus rogersi. And these are urchin barrens, also known as coralline urchin communities or coralline flats. Barrens in New South Wales are a divisive and debated issue. They are usually low productivity areas, devoid of large seaweed and sessile invertebrates. They occur on nearly 600 kilometres of New South Wales coast, with many visible on Google Earth as pale rock. Most nearshore divers, snorkelers and fishers encounter them every trip. The barrens in New South Wales are either a natural part of the underwater environment, or, like many others around the world, an environmental catastrophe caused by humans. There is little middle ground. In the catastrophic scenario, heavy fishing of urchin predators decades ago allowed extensive areas of kelp and other growth to be grazed to barren rock by a ballooning population of urchins. This brought immense impacts that continue today to First Nations sea country and coastal economies. There is not enough scientific evidence yet for conclusive proof of how our barrens erode, and debate and research is continuing. This film shines a light on the possibility of a human cause, the nature of the New South Wales urchins and barrens, and key questions. We use our interviews with experts, our underwater footage and mapping, fishing history data, and other sources. We show the relevance of the New South Wales urchins and debate to Tasmania, recommendations for action.
So
Okay,
just take
so that's just, yeah, that's what it's about.
48 minutes long, but I'm sure Dave will give you the YouTube reference if you'd like.
Yeah, I encourage you to have a look at it. There's a pretty strong case, I believe, that was the loss of predators, and probably in the 1920s, 1930s was when fishing ramped up. And it only has to happen once. So you can return all your predators, but the barrens will stay as they are because the urchins are too big, they don't taste good, there's a lot of reasons, they become hyperstable. That's the argument anyway. It's a divisive argument, but I think, have a look, but I think it is a pretty strong case for it. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Now you have all the speakers here, and now we've got time for a Q&A session. So if anybody has any questions of any of the presenters, then if you'd like to raise your hand, and everybody's happy to talk to you about it. Hi. Sea urchin predators. John, you probably know a fair bit about this.
They've done one of them in Tasmania. Big ones. And I've spoken to Scott. They tried to get lobsters with the sea urchins, hoping they did. But I didn't like the barren habitat either, and they shot them down. I remember seeing some photos at Cronulla when fisheries were there. It was the old City Sky Road building. And there was a couple of classic shots taken in the 30s of the research. We've got tables as big as this stretched out with what we call backwards play. So we've got our lobsters, but there's a big, huge, right? The guy Acton was doing research on the table, each one of these tables, quite a big frame. They still see it here in New Zealand. But the other photo that was on the wall there showed where it was Port Hacking, and it was a string of boats coming in on the summer's day, probably about 1 o'clock in the morning after all the rest are coming up. About 30 footers with open mats, and they were stacked with little lobsters, like a metal pouch. And that was lobsters. They're suggesting now that that's not the case. That the lobster, they move, our eastern lobster moves away. And so there's some of the it's trying to focus on that. It's actually not condemning lobsters from culture. I remember some friends taking up fishing for live paddlefish down in Tasmania when that fishery took off. And talking to the same searcher down there, they'll eat them, but they find them hard to get off the rocks, so they don't flip them over. They'll eat it. So, and the other thing I read read early Australian history about the first fleet people really starting and now how to catch fish. You think Sydney, they weren't very good fishermen, but they did know how to make a cage and trap off. So it's probably one of the first commercial fishermen in Australia. Lots of fishermen. But yeah, the current research is not pointing finger at those. So as we've alluded to, there's more research coming out now, looking into the barren habitat and saying that New South Wales will almost be like this. It's a mosaic of, up in areas. So wherever the sea urchins can't get a foothold, like the railing and the warfare, the seaweed in the surge zones, it would get a foothold. Seaweed grows and, so that's not answering your question, but they have,
Oh, with no on the head, yes. They have diverse predators for a long time. We thought it was just big lobsters. Seems to be that maybe they eat a few urchins, some of the big wrasse, the big parrotfish, but they might eat a few. So it's this healthy ecosystem. You have a lot of predators, each taking a little bite from a few urchins. In the Tasmanian context, where this urchin is now a new species because of climate change, the predators are kind of like the bodyguards. So they're really good at stopping the urchin becoming a problem. But once the urchins are there, no amount of predators can flip that problem back. So physically, you're not eating up urchins fast. We just heard in this one, there's 14,000 urchins. So at that amount of urchins, predators can't control. So predators basically are prevention. They're really good at preventing barrens from forming, but they're not the cure. Predators, you need to intervene.
I think there's another story to be told too. The main predators on sea urchins are when the urchins are at a larval stage, because they're huge breeders with their larval output. If we remove numbers of animals that prey on the larva of urchins, then we'll get a better settlement rate and a better recruitment rate. So it's okay to take the adult urchins away, but if you don't keep taking the adult urchins away, then the larval forms from other areas will recruit in very quickly. But I think that's been demonstrated by the side. So the answer to the question is the biggest predator level on urchins is when they're at the larval stage. And so my question would be, are we monitoring larval urchins out in front of the wharf here?
Yes, thanks, Alan.
It's easy one.
Say,
Just a couple of comments. The global research is that in a healthy environment, the urchins are off molt, they're eaten, they're mouthful issues and lobsters. And there's also some really good research, very recent research published only a month ago. And they actually tethered urchins so that they could see, they had a lot of string or something. So at least you keep track of which urchin's which urchin and see what happens. And they can identify whether it was predated on by fish, by lobster, by something else, by the damage to that urchin. And they were damaged, like they got eaten. And one of the really interesting findings was that the fish predation was proportional to how far away from a population turning on. And that's because of probably snapper. And because there's other really good research, that the size and number of snapper are proportional to their distance from a population centre. That's how many fish fish for snapper.
Yeah.
And so you get the same relationship with your urchin predation, which I think is getting to a strong indicator about what the predator regime is maybe. There might be a correlation. And so, and similarly, lobster, the size of lobsters and the number of lobsters could get to how close you are to population as well. So I think it's really, really interesting work.
any other questions? Well, in that case, I would say thank you very much all for being here. Can I say that Sally and Anthony have put on the seafood lunch for us. John and his colleagues, the urchin fishery and the abalone divers brought in abalone and urchin, so it's going to be pretty special. So if anybody would like to stay for lunch, then you'd be very welcome to do that. I think it's $75 a head for that. There's other things on the menu other than just seafood. There's steak and things like that. So if you would like to stay, you would be very welcome. And otherwise, thank you very much for being here. Hope you've enjoyed it.
I